Practitioners of this craft, welcome back once again to this thing of ours. I'm your host, Neil K. Marcellus, and these are the Chronicles of Gameology, and that's checkmate. Let me start off this episode by sharing a little story with you that would set the tone for what's to come. So once upon a time in the hood, there was a youngster who was baffled and conflicted yet intrigued about a vital aspect of this street philosophy, this thing of ours, this concept called game. So he set out in search of the answer to his enigma, but had to go through several trials and tribulations along the way. But eventually, he found a seasoned OG who was wise enough to provide him the answer to this pressing question. In the midst of the conversation this youngster was having with this seasoned OG, the OG all of a sudden stopped and proposed and directed a riddle towards the youngster. And this riddle, it went like this. What is it that belongs to you, yet others use and put to service most often? The OG smiled, knowing the complexity of what he just asked and its magnitude. This riddle perplexed and puzzled the inquisitive and knowledge-seeking youngster, so he said, I'm at a loss for words on this one, OG. Could you further enlighten me? Sensing that the youngster was at his wit's end and was finally ready for an upgrade and a higher introduction into this street philosophy, the OG gradually leaned forward and replied, the answer to this riddle is your name, which acts as your calling card. But let's up the ante by adding whether it is good or bad. This calling card, the OG emphasized. He pressed on and said, this will add a greater significance to this whole dilemma. My name? How so, OG? The youngster curiously asked. Your name, your calling card, the OG continued, is not used most often by others, but rather is determined by others. This is what a portion of having street cred means, emphasizing that it was street cred that the youngster was fixated on when he first approached the OG initially. The OG continued the lesson and said, this portion of what makes up your street cred, it is by definition public opinion. Why? Because other people must co-sign that which makes you solid or not, which is your character. Being public, it is for others to decide. This is the portion I mentioned to you earlier, the OG reminded the youngster. Hanging on every word the OG was saying, the youngster was finally connecting the dots. The OG finally concluded, shifting back to his initial posture where the conversation originally begun. The OG made his final point and said, and yet, as the riddle has it that I presented to you earlier, it does not totally belong to others. Your street cred, it is truly of your own making. This story highlights and paints a bullseye straight on the importance of the main topic of this episode, because it is said that a solid individual, a well-cultivated character, can be accurately summed up and measured. So as a result, this provides one who is curious a valid and a legitimate value by which one can form an educated and an informed opinion. Because these kind of individuals that were just mentioned, who possess a well-cultivated character, like the story pointed out, are concerned about their reputation. And this very point makes all of this pass the smell test, for the very reason that these caliber of individuals have a reputation in the first place to worry about. So a man who is solid, who has a strong character, and his reputation, his street cred, as it is often referred to within the study halls of the sidewalk university, the trenches, the streets. But a man who is solid, his character can be equated to an object that can produce intense magnification, tossing and throwing an enormous shadow out in front, showcasing and boldly presenting itself for all to see. This enormous shadow symbolizes one's street cred, which is duty, is the representation and advocacy of the man from which this street cred, gets its marching orders from. Like the OG told the youngster back in the story that I presented to you at the beginning of this episode. Consequently, the first powerful advocate that this shadow, one street cred, presents to onlookers and first-hand witnesses of his presence, this shadow, but first to make contact with the greater public, is a man's mouthpiece, his vocabulary. This very fact that I just stated is reinforced by the reality that one's position in the social dynamic hinges on the strength and efficiency of a multifaceted lexicon, language skills. And this is why it is said that it takes at least 700 words for individuals in a relationship to get along, 3,000 words at a minimum to hold down a stable job, and 10,000 words to have an authoritative role within a functional society. You see, as it is being communicated from on this image I'm currently showing, but along with a man's mouthpiece, the other major contributor that actively campaigns on a man's behalf to everyone who comes in contact with this shadow, one street cred. But this other advocate, other than a man's mouthpiece, is the manner, a man's style, his sense of fashion. It transpires like this mainly because, for the very fact that impressions that a man's style, his street cred, have on others from the first and initial contact, but these impressions provide others a easier avenue to get acquainted, which acts as some sort of mental shortcut, a way of conserving mental energy. But these mental shortcuts allow other individuals to make a swift and quick judgment about social interactions. Remember, you can never get a second chance to make a first impression. So researchers have determined that we as people lickety-split form judgments about others in as little as 100 milliseconds. This lightning fast assessment can set the tone for an agreement and a pleasant interaction right off the bat between you and who you come in contact with, because people love meeting others who are easygoing and approachable. A lot of guys straight up have missed the memo on this very fact. So this leads to awkwardness, the lack of confidence, which is part of the title and concern that this episode is about. But this awkwardness, this clumsiness, this hesitation exhibited by a lot of men as a direct outcome of having no street cred, no representation, no advocacy to speak on their behalf. And check this out. Being socially awkward is not a man who is just nervous or shy and who is introverted. So from a street philosopher's perspective, being socially awkward is a dude who makes social interactions difficult and unpleasant for the person or group or individuals that man is interacting with. Also, with the title of this episode, it was mentioned and emphasized the necessity of attaining lionized authority. Now, peep this out. Lionized authority is in conjunction with having street cred because it is associated with being suave or being cool as a cat, due to the fact that a lion, which is the king of the feline species, one could say, but a lion is very alert and observant, but is equally subtle and smooth at the same time. This is the exact reason why street savviness, which is tied in with one's street cred, withholds and retains qualities that can be categorized to something like Tai Chi, because as most of you already know, Tai Chi is all about letting go of tension and just relaxing, which metaphorically connects it to the majestic mannerisms and temperament of the mischievous and demanding to be pampered animal known as a cat. Now, a man's street cred and his street savviness is directly related to ego development, or a lack thereof. I did a whole episode on the necessity of ego development and how the topic has been demonized by Square Society. Here's the link. Check it out once you finish viewing this episode. But the definition of ego development from a gameologist perspective has to do with self-preservation skills, which contribute totally to a man's self-identity. This self-identity, like the story I shared with you at the top of this episode, touched on briefly. But one's self-identity has multiple components that makes up his composition. For this reason, and for the sake of clarity, let me unpack how this self-identity contributes to a man's reputation. So first and foremost, a man's psychology has what one would call a internal self-portrait. And this is one side of the equation. And then there is an outwardly facing component, making up his social eyeballs to eyeballs representation that is presented to everyone he comes in contact with. All of this is concurrent with one's street cred. So for instance, a man possessing the swag and sauce that he is an intelligent individual, if reinforced by facts, then over time he will gain the recognition for his intellectual capabilities. And with consistency, his internal self-portrait, seeing himself as a brainiac and one of the sharpest knives within a given toolbox, would eventually be enhanced to include the outwardly social validation that eventually comes along with such authentic possessing of such trait. So there is an internal self-portrait type of swag and a social constructed type of swag. Both are included as part of one's overall street cred. Reasoning from the facts that I just laid out for you, men who exhibit this awkwardness, which produces a prickly type of personality, by the way, has become stagnant in stage 2 of ego development. Check out this image I'm currently showing. One of the sure signs that a man is in some sort of backwardness as it pertains to ego development from a gameologist's point of view is the occurrence when a man has a unscratchable itch, a preponderance to be overly argumentative. A lot of guys be on this type of bullshit, pseudo quasi fact finding, kamikaze kind of missions, but in all actuality, this is a derivative from a more deeply seated, severely dug in, pessimistic mindset. These type of men will argue you down 12 ways from Sunday that a glass is half empty. You see, stage 2 in a man's ego development from a street perspective can be called the twilight zone. Check out this brand new image I'm currently showing. As this image is indicating, the twilight zone are go-between junctions dealing with a man's awareness. But these transitional periods metaphorically represents a man's mental confusion, which is at its highest between adolescence and the age of 28. Because of mistreatment or neglect and not being properly laced up, this is where personal doubt kicks in heavily. Simply, when this haven't been dealt with properly, then a man will start brooding and agonizing over unsuccessful attempts on how certain things didn't go or didn't pan out. What I just described largely happens because of the prevalent and widespread square mentality that things in life occurs within a vacuum, meaning that things happen in isolation. Many individuals have this kind of hamster wheel circular view on life, spurred on and encouraged by the status quo, which is hell bent on forever trapping individuals into just spinning their wheels, so to speak, locking them into a perpetual self-doubt. On the other hand, when a man is properly laced up on how to navigate through this crucial period between adolescence and the age of 28, which contributes to him developing legitimate street cred, this ability to properly navigate happens to the same degree as a thorough chess player navigates and mentally dukes it out when maneuvering skillfully across a chessboard when playing the game of chess. As most of you already know who watch this channel frequently, I use the game of chess as a metaphor to show application of how one can upgrade and strengthen their participation in this street discipline. This know-how and navigation capability that I just mentioned, cruising and making one's way and bypassing the pessimistic producing stumbling blocks sitting between adolescence and the age of 28, but similar to what I am speaking about in order for one to complete stage 2 ego development. A understanding of this similar skill set is mandatory if one is going to play a game of chess at any efficiency, given that in chess it is a game of action and reaction, causality. So for instance, when your opponent makes a move, you not only need to understand their intentions behind that move, but also you need to predict what future moves they have at their disposal. In addition to this, you yourself need to think many moves in advance in order to efficiently outwit your opponent. This action of forecasting your moves in advance is a necessity component in critical thinking, removing yourself from the hamster wheel that those who struggle in stage 2 of ego development become a casualty of. All of this translates back into being properly laced up about the complicated but necessary multifaceted components of causation, which a chess game symbolizes. Swinging back to the concept of street cred and how causality plays into its development. So from a gameologist perspective, there are 2 categories of causality that a man must know in order to contend with and neutralize any kind of self-doubt, as this pertains to one's street cred. So for instance, utilizing one of these categories of causality that I just mentioned, which is called local causality, so peep game, to demonstrate and paint a picture as to what I'm talking about. Picture this as like a domino effect. Let's start by connecting the need to be solid, which is a person who has character, to the birth and the emergence of having street cred. So this local causality, what I'm emphasizing, it works like this. A man, let's say for instance, a man having the character trait of being courageous, this will dictate and lead him to acting a certain way, where he will conduct himself courageously. Let's say in situations where the conditions is conducive to an individual getting physically hurt. Let's say a boxing match where others is able to observe and notice this kind of action and start talking and speaking about this particular individual within this context, which will brand him as having a reputation for being boldly assertive and the type of individual who would step up. Going back to the concept of action and reaction that I explained earlier in conjunction with playing the game of chess. But check out this brand new image that I'm currently showing. The nature of causality, or action and reaction, can be visualized and demonstrated by doing a play-by-play as to the occurrence taking place within this particular photo. So as this man steps from the boat onto the dock, which in turn will cause the reaction of the boat to move in the opposite direction, producing the course of action, which can be categorized as, for every action, there is an equal or opposing reaction. Let me reposition this line of reasoning that I just laid out for you that would give you a greater appreciation on the implementation that goes into executing this street discipline known as the concept called game. A recurring message that I bring to the forefront on this channel is the genesis and origins of how this street philosophy is produced. That it comes from street knowledge, and street knowledge is the cumulative experience that comes from succeeding and being successful in a no-nonsense environment like the streets. The very virtue by which one accumulates and acquires this type of experience is brought to manifestation by connecting the dots of action and reaction that I just went over, and how this governs and plays out unscripted and organically on this chessboard and these playing fields we call life. But let me spotlight and draw attention to, in order to gain a sufficient quality of street knowledge, it takes a practitioner observing and noticing the course of action on how these 6 essential and consequential factors that this image is showcasing at this moment brings things into existence and manifestation. But these are the multifaceted components that make up the concept regarding causality. Finally, we can definitely conclude that running around helter-skelter on a fucking raggedy ass hamster wheel is not the business, and that achieving legitimate street cred, which is confronting the trials and errors of stage 2 ego development, delivers power and psychological muscle to a practitioner of this street craft, so they can dictate their own success. Because along with this street cred, one achieves lionized authority. And remember, I said that this lionized authority enjoys similar qualities to the art of Tai Chi, which speaks to the 70% rule, whereabouts a practitioner is afforded the ability to be able to flow and not to be stagnant and stiff, where one's concentration and forward momentum can be easily broken. Operating at 70% is top tier and right on the money, and gives a practitioner room to mentally maneuver, so to speak. Being active at or near 100% is approaching a breaking point. 70% provides a practitioner consistency, and consistency is trusting in one's forecasting capabilities. Cause on this chessboard we call life, a immediate solution might not be totally available at that particular time, but the immediate next step that connects the dot is always there, provided if the practitioner comprehends causality, which brings about reestablishment and a victory. Now that's checkmate. Thanks for watching. We'll definitely catch you on the next episode.